And I second that.
Who was that? Councillor Jeffries that seconded,
Yep.
yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other nominations for chair? No? Okay, so all in favour of Councillor Redsell for chair? Yep. So that's unanimous across the committee. So Councillor Redsell is chair of the committee now. So we'll move on to item 2, nomination of vice chair. Can I have nominations for vice chair, please?
Yeah, I'd like to nominate Councillor Kerrin.
Okay. Yep.
I'll second that.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you, guys.
Are there any other nominations for vice chair? No? Okay, so all in favour for Councillor Kerrin as vice chair? It's unanimous across the committee. And I'll pass over to you now, Councillor Redsell, as chair.
Thanks, Wendy, very much. Thank you, guys. Cheers. Are there any apologies for absence, Wendy?
I haven't received any, but I know Councillor Rice is not on this meeting.
Okay. Okay, item 4. Has everybody read the minutes of the last meeting?
Yep.
Everybody happy with them? Okay, item 5. There's no that I know of, Wendy. Any items of urgent business?
No, there isn't.
Okay. And item 6, is there any declarations of interest?
Joy, sorry, Martin's got his hand up.
Okay, didn't see that. Martin?
Hi, yeah, thank you, Chair. It's not so much urgent, but I just noticed now that we haven't got any independent councillors on this committee. Now, I don't know whether that's. I don't think it's a problem constitutionally as such because it's a task force, but there's there's no members of the Thurrock Independent Party or just independents themselves. Just thought I'd note, make a comment and wonder if we could look into that for next time.
Okay, Wendy?
Yes, Chair.
Can we look into that? Any
Yeah.
independents would like to join? They're very welcome.
Yes, of course. I'll make a note of that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Kerrin. Are there any declarations of interest? Take that as a no. Item 7, page 11, terms of reference. I'm hoping everybody's read it, as it's only one page. Can I have hands up to everybody that's read the terms of reference? Councillor Spielman? Sorry, I can't see you on my screen. Councillor Spielman?
Yeah, that's all good, Joy.
Lovely, thank you. Alex?
Yep, I've read them, Joy.
Lovely, okay, thank you. Okay, now we're on to item 8, page 11 to 12. Is it just a report, Wendy, on that one?
For which one, Chair? The item 8, yes?
Yeah.
Yes, I think Lee Nicholson wanted to come in first before the presentation's given by Urups.
Okay. Lee?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. So we have 2 items on the agenda this evening. The first is a infrastructure baseline presentation by ARAPS, who are the consultants working on behalf of the Council. And the second is a report on our wider strategic approach to local plan. Chair, as we've previously discussed at this meeting, we're keen to ensure that the local plan is guided by 3 key principles. That any development arising from the plan is community driven, that the development arising from the plan is of the highest quality, and finally, that the development is supported by front-loaded infrastructure. Of course, in order to ensure that new development arising from the local plan is supported by that infrastructure, it's necessary first to establish a baseline of existing infrastructure in the borough, and this evidence will be used to underpin the plan. I'd really encourage members to consider their own experiences of infrastructure or lack thereof in the borough, and would like the debate to be fed into this area of study. And with your agreement, Chair, I'd like to hand over to Lizzie and to Anna to deliver the presentation. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Lizzie, do you want to share your screen with the presentation? Yeah, can you let me know if you can see that and whether it's in presentation view?
Yeah, that's really good.
Great. And can you hear us okay?
Yes, fine, thank you.
Perfectly.
Okay, great. And also just to say that Ed Waters is on the call as well. He's another colleague from ARAP.
Okay, brilliant, thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks for giving us the opportunity to introduce our work on the infrastructure delivery plan to you. So I'll just briefly introduce the team. And myself, Anna Richards, I'm the project director from ARAP. I'm joined by Lizzie Williams, who's the project manager, and also by Ed Waters, who's a planner in our team and has been working alongside Lizzie on this. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the role and scope of the work we're doing and how it supports the local plan, and also outline the types of infrastructure we're covering in the work. Then I'm going to pass over to Lizzie and Ed, who are going to run through the methodology that we've undertaken to date, and we'll pick up on some of the initial findings in relation to some key infrastructure types. There'll then be an opportunity for discussion and questions. We're at an early stage of the work, so any input and insights that you have into infrastructure capacity issues and local knowledge on infrastructure would be very much welcomed. And we'll take these on board as we move through the next stages of work. We've kept the presentation quite short, but please highlight any areas of particular interest that you'd like to discuss as part of the session this evening, or we'd be very happy to follow up by providing you with further detailed information on the work we've done to date.
Can I just say one thing? Councillor Gerard Rice, Wendy, could you send him the link to the meeting, because he's just called me?
I've already resent the link to him and I've tried to call him into the meeting. It's not picking up.
Okay, he's just rung me, that's all.
Okay, I'll resend again. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay, so ARAP has been appointed by Thurrock to prepare an infrastructure delivery plan to support the preparation of the local plan. The purpose of the IDP is to set out the social and physical infrastructure that will be required to support the level of planned housing and employment growth over the plan period to 2038. And so this is an important part of the evidence base for the local plan. We are aware that the local plan is based on an infrastructure first approach, and therefore it's essential that decisions about location and quantum of growth are based on a firm understanding of infrastructure provision and requirements. So the first stage of this work, which is now nearing completion, is to prepare an infrastructure baseline assessment, and the role of this is to understand existing provision across the area, understand any existing capacity constraints or indeed any surpluses if these exist, to identify current known planned infrastructure projects, so for example school expansions or planned investment in the highways network, identify any any infrastructure issues that may constrain or influence the location of growth, and that need to be discovered as the spatial strategy is being developed. Okay, next slide. So as you'll be aware, the local plan is set to deliver ambitious levels of growth, anticipated 30,000 new homes and 24,000 new jobs to 2038. The issues and options consultation included a range of options for delivering this growth, including new settlement, major urban extensions, smaller urban extensions, village extensions, and urban intensification. And we understand, given the scale of housing need and the potential for growth in the area, that the preferred option that will be taken forward through the local plan is likely to be some form of combination of a range of these options. Okay, next slide. So once the spatial strategy for growth, including housing numbers and employment numbers by settlement, is confirmed, as well as the trajectory and phasing of that growth, the second stage of the IDP will be undertaken. And this will consider the additional infrastructure required to support planned growth across Thurrock. So we'll include what infrastructure projects are needed and when. So the timing, phasing and triggers, key trigger points for infrastructure projects, the costs of these, who's responsible for delivering them, any identified sources of funding, which will then enable us to identify the scale of the funding gap for the infrastructure required to support and deliver the local plan. And this will all be set out in a comprehensive schedule, which will be a live document, which will be updated by the council on a regular basis as the local plan progresses to examination and adoption and beyond. So in terms of the range of infrastructure types that we'll be covering, it will cover the full range of infrastructure. This first slide covers physical infrastructure, so transport, including highways, Lower Thames Crossing, rail, public transport and active travel. The full range of energy and utilities providers, also looking at flood defence, at full range of waste assets and infrastructure requirements, and at digital connectivity infrastructure requirements. We're also cognizant of the fact that infrastructure needs to be resilient to climate change, and also that some types of infrastructure play a key role in climate change mitigation. And you may be aware that the council is developing a climate change strategy, which, when complete, will identify a range of mitigation projects which will need to be included and reflected in the final IDP. Next slide covers social infrastructure, so we'll be looking at education at all levels, from early years through to further education, full range of indoor and outdoor.
Just interrupt just 1 second.
Sure.
Yeah, it's Joy. Sorry to the chair. Sorry to interrupt. Just one. Do you want us to leave questions till the end, members, or do you want us to come in on lots of bits of it?
I think it might be useful to run through the presentation and then have questions at the end, if that's okay.
No, that's fine.
We might be covering what you're asking later on in the presentation.
No, brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. So yes, the full range of indoor and outdoor sports and leisure facilities, healthcare provision, emergency services, so all the blue light services, community facilities, including youth, library, community halls, etc., and green infrastructure network, and the full range of open space networks, from parks and gardens through to natural and semi-natural green space, children's play and amenity, etc. Next slide. Okay, so I'll just pass on to Lizzie, who's going to run through the methodology of this first stage of the work and start to outline some of the key findings that's coming through.
Thanks, Anna. So the study begins with a policy review. So this looks at your national and local requirements about why an infrastructure delivery plan is required. It's worth noting that national policy now requires an infrastructure funding statement to be completed, which audits all the infrastructure projects that have been delivered and paid for that previous year. And the advantage of having them in an infrastructure delivery plan also means that they are likely to receive some developer contributions once they're evidence-based as a required need. So once we've undertaken the policy review, we move on to a review of all publicly available any documents and strategies. These are varying degrees of when they've been published, but we try and go for the most up-to-date. Well, we always go for the most up-to-date as possible, and then we use a consultation to fill in any sort of gaps between the last strategy and any sort of identify any gaps and rationalise inconsistencies with any data we found, and also to discuss the ability of current infrastructure to serve the population. So the consultation is undertaken with Thurrock Council and any external providers where that infrastructure is provided elsewhere. And just a quick canter through the types of questions we'd ask during our consultation, which generally at this stage anyway are sort of infrastructure baseline stage, looks at the current infrastructure constraints, shortfalls or issues. And then it looks at the likely threshold, so how many more years that infrastructure can accommodate growth, and the likely year that will trigger a requirement. And we generally ask the question over the plan period, although there's scope for them to sort of speak at will. Then we move on to asking for existing development proposals, such as planned expansions or new provision. And this allows us to understand sort of what tolerance of growth can be accommodated in under planned provisions. Then we move on to known constraints and a discussion on risk and opportunities for alternative deliveries mechanisms. This is always quite relevant for things like health, where they might be moving away from a key hospital and smaller GPs to maybe towards slightly larger health centres. And then we've tried to summarise this and what this means for the implications of spatial scenarios for your infrastructure provision to help you identify broad locations. We're moving on to some of the emerging findings. We're only concentrating on 5 because we're short of time. So we're looking at transport, education, health, utilities and flooding. Those are generally the schemes which become critical in the classified critical in the scheme, and generally the ones where there's more interest. These are initial findings from our document review and consultation with relevant officers and externals, but we'd welcome a discussion on whether these findings reflect your understanding at a local level. So we move on first to transport. Highways, through consultation and review, it's generally understood that was a capacity constraint leading to congestion, overcrowding and journey time unreliability reported on the whole road network. This is more significant for the north to south routes where there are already fewer strategic routes. When considering the further expansions of both the ports and Lower Thames Crossing, this is likely to further exacerbate issues, particularly on the A13, A108 and A128, and that's before any of the employment and housing growth is factored in. We understand that transport modelling is forthcoming and underway, so it has missed our baseline assessment. However, that's likely to come out with more projects that we need to include when we pick up the second stage of this study. Moving quickly on to rail and bus, so public transport. Consultation sort of raised ambitious plans for 2 new rail stations to be built at Stamford Hope and at Corringham. Worth noting that this latter scheme is, while supported by Thurrock Council, isn't supported yet by National Rail due to concerns over speed on the network. The other conflict we've had, which is likely to impact on growth, is this conflict between sustainable freight movements from HGV, so trying to move heavy goods vehicle movements, particularly from the highly industrial areas, onto the rail. However, the conflict there is making sure that there's always pedestrian capacity as well at the same time. But as written here, it's nationally recognised conflict, so I know there's quite a lot of work going on to work out how those two can be rationalised together. Oh, I've just skipped on. Great. Buses, actually, it was generally reported it was good. There was good bus use across the district and good accessibility in rural areas. And there are always lots of plans to improve connections to key economic hubs within Thurrock, so your Grays, your Lakesides, and sorry, not your Lakesides, and to other key areas in South Essex. And what was quite interesting was there was proposals for integrated ticketing system similar to an Oyster card system, which would ease the interchange between the two modes of transport. Quickly on active travel, the active travel strategy was released in 2020, so it's very up to date. And it states there's a great opportunity for an increase in the level of active travel in Thurrock, partly because it's flexible, healthier, cheaper, cleaner, better for the environment. However, it is noted that car does remain the most common mode of transport in Thurrock, with 61% of total average miles travelled within the borough being by car. The strategy outlines a range of different areas where cycle and walking network is lacking, and so where schemes will be prioritised, and it also does list a significant amount of projects in there, which we've set out in the baseline report. So that's the overview on transport. Moving quickly to utilities. And this covers electricity, gas, potable water and wastewater. Electricity is supplied by UK Power Networks. I've got more detailed notes if you do want to know any more, but I'm conscious of time, so I will just run through that there are likely to be some capacity issues here. Oh, sorry. There are substations at West Thurrock, West Horndon, Tilbury and Grays, which are running at full or nearly at full capacity. There are planned upgrades here, but the UK Power Networks have warned us that the capacities are constantly renewed as new applications come forward, and new applications for development connections work on a first come first served basis. So what we've reported now may not be the case in however many years' time based on how many new connections. So there'll be a process of ongoing engagement, but we do understand that there are some capacity issues on the whole network. Gas is supplied by Cadent Gas. We couldn't actually speak to anyone face to face. We just didn't manage to find a contact. At the next stage of the study, we will pick this up to try and initiate further conversations again. However, from our review of documents, there doesn't seem to be any particular problems with existing gas infrastructure. However, we do recognise that gas demand will be high given the large commercial industrial operations throughout Thurrock. So this does need to be constant engagement with Cadent Gas. Moving on to potable water, this is supplied by Essex and Suffolk Water. They confirmed that Thurrock is supplied by the Herringate Reservoir, which has more than enough capacity to provide for Thurrock and surrounding areas. And they reported that they confirmed there was no concern for water supply in the borough, and that was factoring future growth as well, the estimate future growth. Finally, wastewater provided by Anglian Water. They've identified investment at Tilbury Wastewater Works treatment. Sorry, have I said that right? A wastewater treatment works to accommodate the future growth, and this will be implemented around 2030, which is the latter end of the plan periods. They did say that there's no identified works at the Stanford La Hope Wastewater Works treatment. However, this is going to have to be reviewed because it's likely that one will need future upgrades within that catchment area. Oh, sorry. Flood defence. Flood percent has major implications for determining the location of growth across the borough, given that a significant amount of the borough is within flood risk zone 3, which was the highest risk area, particularly around the southern strip of the borough and around the Mardyke Valley. A sequential test has to be applied to direct development to areas of the lowest possibility of flood risk. However, consultation was indicated that lost my notes. engagement with the Environment Agency has agreed in principle, so it's not a definite go ahead, it's in principle, that the council can develop allocations within flood risk zone 3 where it's proven the exception test. Finally, the local plan is likely to include a policy as well on strategic sites around the riverfront to integrate flood risk within development. To integrate flood defence within the development proposal. And the final point on flood is that the strategic flood risk assessment is being updated and will be updated when the growth numbers become available, which should tie in with our programme too. So at this stage, we're using a fairly old 2010 strategic flood risk assessment, but we'll update all our information once that comes available. And that I've covered very quickly the physical infrastructure, but I'm going to pass over to Ed, who's going to speak about the social infrastructure, so education and health.
Thanks, Lizzie. Just to point out, so for both primary and secondary education, we based our analysis on the latest pupil place plan of Thurrock that Thurrock produced, and for that analysis, we've used the same areas as provided in the pupil place plan. So for primary education, the majority of school areas are nearing or at capacity and facing a shortfall in places in future. There is an exception of Grays, but it is worth noting that this is mostly due to the expansion at Harris Mayflower in 2016. Through consultation with Thurrock Council, we've understood that there are plans to expand some schools in the Aveley, Ockenden and Purfleet area and the Corringham and Stamford Le Hope area. But this is an area for that faces quite a lot of capacity constraint. So we'll need a fair bit of investment to accommodate future growth. Okay, the next slide. And then with secondary education, so generally, again, the provision is quite capacity constrained, but we understand that there is some work being done to solve this. So the new Harris Academy Riverside, for example, alleviated previous constraints in the west area. There is a known capacity constraint in the central area, but we are aware that 2 new schools are opening this year, and they're opening in temporary accommodation to begin with before moving to larger campuses in a couple of years' time. And there's also in the east, there is planned expansion at St Clair's, and that will mean that the area will be considered to have sufficient capacity for the existing population. However, as with primary education, there will be a need to further school places to be provided to meet the expected population growth. As per the projections in the pupil place plan, that plan provides a 5-year population growth, and yeah, that all the areas are expected to have capacity issues. So moving on to health. So it's worth noting that the existing provision on GP surgeries does not meet the needs of the existing population when comparing the patients per GP figure with the national average. As you can see on screen, it's quite a lot further below. However, and it is also worth noting that the majority of GPs are still accepting new patients. The 5 clinical commissioning groups across the Mid and South Essex area are looking to improve secondary care facilities such as the accident and emergency services at Southend, Basildon and Chelmsford hospitals. And part of these plans include the provision of 4 new integrated medical centres across Thurrock. There's 1 confirmed for Tilbury, 1 confirmed for Purfleet and 2 others that are to be confirmed but likely to be in Grays and Corringham. So these medical centres will seek to provide a range of services under one roof, and that will include acute services but also GP services, and therefore that provision is expected to help alleviate the pressure on the GPs, by providing a more direct path to specialist service, but also by increasing the square footage that GPs will have across the borough. I think it's back over to Anna to discuss the next steps.
Okay, thank you. So we have completed the first draft of the baseline assessment, which is currently being reviewed by the council. And the second stage of the infrastructure delivery plan will be undertaken once the spatial strategy for growth is confirmed, in particular housing numbers, distribution by settlement, and the trajectory over the plan period. And during this stage, we will work to understand the implications of that spatial strategy for housing employment, in terms of what additional infrastructure is required to support planned growth, both in terms of the location and quantum of infrastructure, so what is required and where, as well as the phasing of the infrastructure required and key triggers based on the local plan trajectory. We're also assessing in some detail the costs of infrastructure required and where there's available funding. And this will enable us to identify the scale of the funding gap that needs to be funded through other means. Okay, next slide. I think that's all for our presentation. So yes, any questions, be very welcome to discuss. And as I said, this is a very sort of brief overview of what's quite a substantial baseline report. So any areas you'd like some further details on, we'd be more than willing to help with that.
Thanks, Anna.
Should I stop sharing, or do you want to look at any slides?
That's fine, as long as every other member can hear me, that's fine. I think you've taken it off already, Anna. I've got quite a few questions, as you can imagine, but what I'm going to do is I'm only going to ask 2 of them and then let the other members come in case I've doubled up on anything. My first one is the transport on the river. That didn't come up on your first slide at all. And I wondered if you've taken that with the talks that are going on with the river taxis and what's opening, maybe Purfleet, Grays, Tilbury,
Yeah.
Southend, Gravesend. So that's one question. Do you want me to ask them both the questions?
Very quickly on the response. It might be, just what's in my memory, we have covered river transport in the report. It's quite high level at this point. We haven't spoken to any providers as such, but it in the report, so I can.
Going on, Lizzie.
Sorry, say that again. Let me just check. We do have some sea transport and ports. We've sort of looked at the Port of Tilbury websites and the London Gateway to look at the provision there and look at how they're looking at the river that way. But if there's any other direction we should be taking it, please do let us know.
I think what the talks are doing is that when we do build Purfleet, if it gets, whatever happens with that, and Grays and Tilbury, we need a flexible service. If we're talking about getting cars off the road, then that's our only way. Our ferry is well out of date, and we should be looking at something that is taking people from these strategic points to go to London. It's an easier way to travel. It's less stressful, and it gives people, the car parking is there at Tilbury, wherever to leave your car or get dropped off. So I think it's something we ought to look at.
Agreed. I think our focus really has just been on how the ports could better use the river, but we can certainly expand that chapter to look into passenger transport.
Okay. Just on what do you think will make a difference with COVID to this plan? Because obviously it is stopping a lot of things from going forward. We're going to be late with a lot of things, aren't we?
We did think about this before we came. A couple of things. This was all prepared before COVID, so all the findings are pre-COVID. So I imagine the next time we pick this up, we might get different answers. But as well to say, the government making the right noises about stimulating the economy again based on infrastructure and infrastructure spend. I guess our response to that would be it's ill-defined, it's very early and there's limited detail, so it doesn't have much of an impact on our work now and probably within the next 6 months. But I think it's something we should be cognizant of, especially when we get to the stage of costing and we try to look at funding delivery, where it can come from and sort of who can be apportioned for. And we, it's possible we could do a separate paper on funding and finance and work out basically direct to where these things could come from, and who knows what those funding channels will look like in a year's time.
Okay, thank you, Lizzie. It's lovely. I'll ask a couple of other questions if nobody else picks it up. Does anybody else wish to speak?
Councillor Stillman's got his hand up.
Okay, Councillor Luke.
Could I speak at some stage, yeah?
Luke.
Hello, Joy.
Okay, go ahead.
I must admit, I found the presentation somewhat basic. I'll be honest. It was there wasn't much in there that isn't already in the public domain. And I suppose my question is about Arup. What major comparable projects have you been working on before and seen to a successful conclusion? And in 2040, 2035, 2040, I'm looking, if I'm still on this earth, I'm looking back. What am I gonna look back on and think, it's a good thing we hired Arup, because without these guys, this wouldn't have happened. So what are you? What are you gonna deliver for Thurrock as a consultant that we so desperately need?
Okay, I think I'll just pick up first of all on your first point that the presentation was a bit basic. I think we tried to keep it very short and provide a high-level summary of the findings of what is sort of several hundred pages worth of report on the work done to date. And so I think it might be useful to potentially share some more detailed analysis with you, which hopefully will reassure you that a lot of work has gone into the baseline assessment to date. In terms of not being anything that's not in the public domain, I mean, the basis of the work to date has been consultation with relevant officers across Thurrock and external providers such as utilities companies. And in our experience, at the baseline stage of work, where you're not in a position to ask people what are the implications of planning X number of homes in this location over this period, it's sometimes quite difficult for people to engage or to assess what the implications are and what infrastructure investments are required. So I suppose by nature, the baseline assessment might be telling you to a certain extent things that you already know, but it's compiling all that information into one place and sort of synthesizing it so that you can understand settlement by settlement what the infrastructure issues are, capacity issues across the range of types. The second part of your question is about our experience of doing this. We have, I think, completed upwards of 15 infrastructure delivery plans now to support local plans across the country, including going through examination, going through the examination process, appearing at the examination, and our infrastructure delivery plans as part of the evidence base being found sound through that process. So we've got pretty extensive experience of doing this at a local level, at a local authority level, and at a strategic level. So again, be very happy to sort of share any examples of our completed pieces of work that would hopefully reassure you that we've got the experience to take this through, and help you to find the local plan sound through the examination process. There was a third part to the question as well, wasn't there? About
I wanted you to make me go wow. Come on, where's your big wow factor? Tell Arup to me.
Well, I mean, I suppose one particular selling point is the relationship with the climate change work that we're doing. So looking at how infrastructure both needs to be resilient to climate change, but also can play a really important role in adapting and mitigating the impacts of climate change. And what I think one of the key benefits of this will be that we're also leading that work, and we can take both pieces of work forward in an integrated way and ensure that the local plan is based on an assessment of infrastructure that properly takes into account the implications of climate change.
One of my big drives is air pollution and other pollutants as well, rather than the macro, like at a micro level within Thurrock. So, you know, I'd love to see a local plan that is pollutant neutral, or even maybe reduces pollutants through good design in Thurrock than what they are at the moment. So for me, that sort of work, that will make me go wow. So, thank you for your
sorry. I'll let Sean explain the scope more, but that's what the scope of the climate change work has done. Again, it's at baseline stage, but it's looked at risks and emissions, and it's charted them and basically presented them. And the second stage will be picking that up into a strategy to make the local plan both as carbon zero as possible, what stage as that can be. And to build on Anna's point about Arup, that's sort of the benefit, is that we've got all the skill sets under one roof, really. So our transport colleagues have also worked on the transport connectivity study, so we can share the findings from that. Early discussions as well about what energy work we can do, what can undertake in the area. So we've got advantage of local knowledge now, because we've been able to work on two different work streams. And when we don't know the planning team, our infrastructure colleagues are just across the corridor virtually at the moment.
Also, just picking up your points on air quality, Arup have done quite a lot of research into this area, and looking at how development can be air quality positive, which was used to support the London Plan, which has got quite a progressive policy on air quality and new development. So again, we do bring a kind of really extensive range of technical expertise, both in sort of infrastructure, air quality, environment, which we can bring to bear on the next stages of work.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Brilliant.
Anna, can I just butt in there, just to say that perhaps Councillor Spillman can be sent some of the stuff that we dealt with last time, with the sort of Aveley and South Ockenden, those sort of areas that we were talking about with the Prince's Trust. Perhaps it's something, you know, he could have a little read of, just to see that what we have been discussing in, you know, the meetings we've had before. So it might be sort of good for him to see that. You know, it's
okay.
Wendy, is Councillor Rice wanting to speak?
Yes, I believe Councillor Rice did want to speak earlier.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, please.
Councillor Rice?
Yes, Luke does make a very good point on air pollution. You would probably be aware that Thurrock has the worst COPD figures outside of London in the UK, and we really need to target that, because this is affecting the health of this populace in Thurrock. And the other thing that I didn't see on your list, when you talked about sports, I never saw anything about golf, and golf is a very widely played game in Thurrock, having 3 courses in the Thurrock, no, 4 courses in the Thurrock area. The other thing is I never saw anything about a possible private hospital. When you talked about burial yards, I never saw anything about a crematorium. As we build 32,000 homes, it is quite clear that we will have to move towards crematoria, because there's one thing for you have the facility at Upminster is shot to pieces, and why should Thurrock residents have to travel out of the borough to Pitsea, when particularly when you look at our graveyards, they are filling up fast. I mean, I represent Chapel St Mary, and I can tell you we're running out of space in that burial yard. So, you know, there are a few questions. The other question I would like to ask, why you didn't mention in your infrastructure about the east-facing slips on the A13. And one further question, sorry to bombard you, but what are the plans for the lower part of Grays? Because we have one slither of industrial land left there called Rippleside Metals. We've talked for a long time to redevelop that frontage, but nothing appears to come forward. So I'd be interested in your answers.
Okay. Okay, so picking up first of all the point about golf, Lizzie, are you able to take that one?
I think we can revisit it. Normally when we look at sports, we look at the standards set by Sports England, and I think they've moved away from standards for golf. So generally we only use it when there's sort of a fixed population per facilities, but we could certainly address it qualitatively if we aren't able to pick it up quantitatively. And the same with a private hospital. Generally we haven't looked at private provision, and that includes in sport, health, sort of other services. So that's why that wouldn't have been picked up.
Is there a specific proposal that you are referring to that you wanted us to reflect, or is it just a general need for that type of provision?
It is a general need, because if you build 32,000 homes, there are some very well-off people in Thurrock. Believe it or not, we're not all paupers. And the NHS will depend on the private sector to dig itself out of trouble, because the waiting list through COVID has gone up tremendously. We're now talking about a 5-year wait for a hip operation or even a knee replacement. So it'll only be the private sector that can actually drive that those lists down, and that's why I'm particularly interested in that. The crematoria, to me, it's a no-brainer. It's got to be done, because why cannot the Thurrock people bury their own people within the Thurrock boundaries? And crematoria, I believe myself, in the distant future, will replace burial yards, because space will become more precious, if you understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We've included crematoria. Oh, sorry, Anna.
Sorry.
We've included some discussion on crematoriums in the full report, so we'll share that. But largely it was just to say that consultation did raise that the council are considering potential provision of a crematorium. I think at this stage there are no further details, but it's possible that when we pick the study up again for stage 2, there's finer grade detail we can report. But all that we were able to garner now at consultation, what that it's been considered, so it is in the report. And your other point,
okay, sorry, on the east-facing slips.
Yeah. So that's also addressed as well. I think we were just short of space in our presentation and had to pull out what we thought might be the key items, but it is addressed in the report. And that as well, I didn't mention as well, we've consulted over Lower Thames Crossing, and there's a separate section in the baseline to address that as well.
So the issues on the A13 and the east facing slips are covered in some detail in the report, and
yes,
the highways officers at Thurrock discussed that at some detail with us. So, and the final point on the lower part of greys and rippleside metals, are council officers able to pick that up? And developments coming forward?
I've certainly had discussions with this particular site since I was mayor of the borough in 2003-04. We've had many meetings, but we don't seem to have much action from our officers. So it really needs to be pushed forward, because this is the last remaining industrial part of our heritage, if you like, within this part of Grays. It would be an ideal an opportunity to actually put some fancy restaurants, some quality housing down there, and perhaps even rebuild the Thurrock Yacht Club into the bargain. Because all these things need to be considered, for the simple reason that if you look at the Thurrock Yacht Club, that's in the ownership of Thurrock Council. They own the land. Obviously, Thurrock Yacht Club have a tenancy, you know, have a lease, etc. And I think the river frontage, the Thurrock Thames Gateway did talk about that river frontage, but all they seem to do is produce very expensive brochures. But again, there was no action, and I'm just intrigued how we will drive that forward.
Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, Anna. Just picking up on Councillor Rice said about golf. We know that cricket and football are the two main sporting things, but in Thurrock we've lost St Clair's, part of St Clair's golf course. We've lost, or we're going to perhaps lose another one, South Ockenden. I'm not sure where that is at the moment. On the 128, we may lose that one because of housing. So I think it's something we ought to be looking at for kids to have another level to go to. You know, it's not only cricket and football. There are other sports out there we ought to be giving the kids another look at, even if it's just a virtual something. You know, I know Lakeside has probably got one, you know, the way you can go and virtually hit a ball. So I think it's something like that. If we look at that within schools, that might be something, you know, they could pull into a school. It's just giving the kids another avenue to go down.
Yeah, definitely happy to pick that up.
Yeah, thank you for that. Has anybody else got any questions, Wendy?
Yes, it's Councillor Kerrin, then Councillor Anderson, Sean, and
Thank you. Councillor Kerrin.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think I'll do the same as the others and just ask all the questions in one go. It seems to be working well. So, firstly, in terms of the housing, and it's anticipated 30,000 new homes and 24,000 new jobs, I'd like to see more work in how those homes are going to be linked to the jobs that are being created, both in terms of type of job and geography of where the jobs are being created. Equally, how the 30,000 homes are going to be also put for the benefit of current residents of Thurrock. And this is picking up on something which looking at the minutes, which I mentioned in the last meeting, which is about social housing and housing waiting lists. We have an awfully long list, and I want to sort of know, in terms of the methodology of the 30,000 homes, how many of them are going to be put towards social housing and affordable housing. Picking up on sports, which I was going to mention, I'm going to take it from a slightly different angle to Councillor Rice and the Chair. I'm looking at sort of sports clubs and things like that, which, you know, get community involvement. And Within my patch of Grays, there is a community-led football team, Grays Athletic, who are homeless and have been for a long time now. And I'd like to see ideas for how community-driven sports clubs, which provide not only sports but also participation and a sense of belonging to the community, can be supported. When you mentioned rail and bus, I'm pleased you mentioned the train station at Stamford Le Hope, but I think there's one which is which I was expecting to see, which is Grays train station with the underpass, because it links to trying to put more capacity into rail, because a lot of the freight rail coming from Corriton is going to go through Grays, and with the plans that are afoot for Grays and the riverside and all that sort of thing, I think we need the underpass to be a real high priority in this local plan. Just I think one more thing. We were talking about education and in terms of school capacity, and there's an awful lot of exploring opportunities, or there's potential here. There's not a lot of, in terms of primary at least, there's not a lot of definite sort of ideas here. And obviously we don't want to be in a situation where we build the homes but we don't have the school places to follow. And finally, in terms of the integrated medical centres, now I know you said Tilbury and Purfleet are confirmed and Corringham and Grays are to be confirmed but likely to be. Now I'm not doubting whether they'll be there or not, but what I really want to know is, will these integrated medical centres reduce the Thurrock average for a GP? Because like it says in your reports, the UK average is 1,818 patients per GP, whereas in Thurrock it's 2,739. And as well as I'd really like to know how we're going to sort of equalise that so Thurrock residents get a good deal out of their GPs. And that's my questions. I look forward to the answers. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, shall I pick up the infrastructure related points, and then I could pass over to Thurrock officers to deal with the housing and social housing related questions. In terms of sports and the need to consider community-led football, an issue raised about a particular team in Grays, I think that's really helpful to highlight to us. And I think it has, I think I'm right in thinking, Lizzie, that was also highlighted by the council officers that we spoke to, and is identified in the report as an issue. Similarly, Grays train station underpass is something that was raised as part of the Grays town centre improvements plans, and is reflected as a priority in the baseline report, and will be taken forward through the IDP in the next stages. With regards to schools, the work that we've done to date has looked at existing capacity issues and any known current planned improvements. Now, obviously, as plans for housing are developed as the next stage, as part of the next stage of the local plan, there'll need to be much more specific proposals about new schools, where they're going to go, when they need to be delivered, and similarly any expansions of existing that will be needed to support growth, probably including new schools as part of major new site allocations in the local plan. So absolutely and definitely going forward, there will need to be more developed and precise proposals for how schools are going to be expanded, or new schools will be provided to support growth. And on the issue of the integrated medical centres, we had a discussion with the CCG as part of the baseline stage, and they communicated that this is their strategy for part of their strategy anyway for medical provision across the district over the plan period. But yes, we definitely want to pick up in the next stages of work how exactly that's going to impact on GP provision, and how that's going to reduce pressure in a practical sense on existing GPs, because as you highlight, it was quite a stark finding that GP surgeries in Thurrock are so oversubscribed. So it's definitely been highlighted as a key issue that needs to be addressed going forward. So I think that was all the infrastructure related issues that you raised.
Sort of the housing stuff now, I think, which is more for the officers, I think you're suggesting. So
Anna, did you hear that?
it's just all I'm sort of looking for now is the answers related to the housing, especially affordable and social housing. I don't know. I think you said that might be something you'll defer to Thurrock Council officers for.
Yes, I think so. It's sort of outside the remit of our workers on infrastructure delivery plan.
Okay.
I think Lee and Sean have both got their hands up to deal with those questions.
Lee, shall I start in terms of where we are with the housing issue? Basically, the local authority will be working with the other South Essex authorities to bring forward a full revision to the Strategic Housing Market Assessment Study, which covers all housing needs going forward to 2038. The key part of that will be to look at what are the affordable housing needs of Thurrock and to actually look at how we then address it through the plan making process. Now, we have already commissioned a scoping report and the work's been undertaken by Turley's, and the idea is that over the next 6 to 7 months, working with the housing departments across South Essex and partners, we will actually pull together the information that will help us demonstrate that there is an affordable housing need, what level of that housing need there is, and what are the mechanisms for actually addressing that. We'll take that forward as part of the plan making process. It's a separate piece of work, and we should have said at the beginning to help Lizzie and Anna, is that the infrastructure work is one of a number of work streams. It is a baseline study, so it's based on what information currently exists. And as we've said in previous meetings, a lot of the information we've had is historic and out of date, and that's why we've commissioned a raft of other technical studies to inform the local plan process. I think we need to also bear in mind that there is a transport baseline study which will sit alongside the infrastructure study, and at some stage in the future we'll merge the two documents. But that transport study will be looking at all the issues such as heat spacing, slips, bus rail use, sustainable transport modes, and we hope to report back to the task force in the autumn on that piece of work. I think it's also worth noting that at the previous meeting we had a presentation from KKP on Gatwick Place strategy, and I know as Councillor Rice asked the question, what does the report say about golf? And the consultant wasn't able to answer the question. Yes, that study does cover golfing issues, and again we're happy to sort of like make available the relevant extracts from that report if you'd like, in terms of information now. But again, that report will hopefully be going to Cabinet in the autumn, and so the idea is that we will then report back to the task force when the report's due to go. On the issue of health, I mean, we've had some difficulties in moving forward with the local plan, not insurmountable problems because of COVID-19, but one sector obviously that's been heavily impacted upon in terms of their availability is public health, because they've been doing other things. It's been difficult to get the meetings in the diary and to have those full discussions on what the future health wellbeing needs of the borough will be, but we will endeavour to do that over the forthcoming months.
Thank you, Sean. Lee, did you want to come in at all?
No, thanks, Chair. Sean's covered it. Thank you.
Okay. Alex, did you want to come in with a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Joy. A couple of questions I wanted to ask have been covered by other councillors. So I just have the one sort of follow-up question, really, and it's with regard to something Joy brought up, and that's the impact of COVID. Now, this evening we've looked through a report that has, you said in one of your answers to Councillor Spillman, sort of covers hundreds of pages of findings and data, etc. Now, given that whether we like it or not, COVID is probably going to cause some massive changes to the way we operate, the way we live. Are you not sort concerned that perhaps the findings that you now have won't reflect the way we're living and our impact in the future?
If I take that quickly, I think you're absolutely right, but I think the second stage, the part of the methodology going on from that will be to review and probably revise a lot of our baseline information, partly because new strategies will come. We would have done it anyway because new strategies would have come available, information's moved on, especially around Lower Thames Crossing, for example. But I think now is even more imperative that that's a larger part of our methodology than previously. I'm doing some other work in South Essex, and it's encouraging that I've spoken to CCG since the COVID outbreak, and they were very forthcoming and said they didn't want to drop their, inverted commas, business as usual, so their infrastructure plan support, because they're overloaded and other things. So I'm quite sure we'll get some good information back from them, especially around sort of integrated medical centres. But it's useful to have this conversation so we can go to them with more specific questions than a general overview on their strategy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lizzie. Cheers. Andrew, I know did you want to come in at all? Andrew? Is he still there,
Sorry,
Andy?
sorry, yes, sorry, Chairman. Thank you.
I don't know whether you wanted to come in or not.
I mean, I think colleagues have covered a lot of the points that I wanted to raise. All I'd do is re-emphasise, I suppose, what Councillor Spillman said. Sorry, I'll switch my camera on, being rude. And that is the details of the report, I mean, didn't really tell us anything we didn't already know that's not out there in the public domain. So what would be really useful is what's in that report that we don't know, that you found out. And that would be, I'm not asking you to do that now, because if the report is, you know, hundreds of pages long, but for the next meeting, for you to tell us something that I don't know. I mean, Councillor Rice, I'm sure will know it, because he's been around for quite a long time, but some of us that haven't, you know, would be useful. What have you found that we don't know, so that we can then, you know, put questions to you about housing, about education. That would be my.
I think we've had some really interesting conversations, especially with everyone. The document's supposed to be made public, so we had to make sure that everything we've reported can be made public. So every time we wrote our minutes and sent them back to providers, they basically signed it off and said, we're prepared to let this in the public domain. What we do have perhaps is early indications of I think there were a few football pitches, for example, that might get lost if Lower Thames Crossing, the preferred route, goes in X direction. So we do have that sort of intel, but the reason it is all public is because we've spoken to the ambulances and police services, and they've got early conversations about try collaboration between all the blue lights, and they've got quite exciting plans of how that can work together, feeding into the sort of the Essex developers guide, and making a training centre which will be somewhere in Essex. But again, it's too early in their business case, and they didn't want it out in the public. So everything we've reported has to be, like I said, signed off by then. But that's not to say that, we now have some intel that we can pass over.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Lizzie. Just to ask a couple of things that haven't come up. You said you were working from a 2010 flood risk. That seems quite a way away,
yeah,
isn't it, from now?
And again, so that was for the state. That was for the flood risk assessment level 2, but we've got a more up-to-date level 1. The flood risk 2 is being prepared currently, so by the time we pick it up again, we know it'll be available. So we will update the report to reflect that. But similarly, that's why we undertake the consultation, to bridge that gap, to work out what's happened in the last 10 years. And we run through all the findings that we found in in a slightly older document, and part of the process is to knock out any projects which are no longer required or have been delivered, and they let us know what they're superseded by. So yeah, it's exactly that exercise of trying to bridge that gap between
I've only
the two.
asked that, Lizzie, because of what is being built at Tilbury at the moment, where now the Thames will look for some other way, the little rivers or whatever will look for another way to the Thames, and that's when flooding starts to happen, and that will just find its way back to Tilbury town, you know. So it's all those buildings and everything and the concrete that's going down.
Definitely.
So you've not got the fields where you had the little inlets around the edges, which used to take the water out. So I've only asked because of that.
No, it's useful, and the flooding, the climate change strategy, which is again separate to this piece of work, but speak to each other. That picks on flooding mitigations quite a lot.
Yeah, the only other two things I've got is how much have we worked with the bus companies? Is it worth us having them here to ask their views on what they feel transport should be? And in one of your slides, you put up green and networks. Could you a bit more clarity in that?
What did it say, sorry?
It says green and networks. Under that is parks. I just want to know what green and networks is. I think it was on the second slide.
Yeah.
Coming down.
I imagine that should have said green infrastructure networks, which are exactly sort of, well, there could be linear connections between existing green spaces or made green spaces, and they have a multitude of benefits, which do include flood risk mitigation, but also improved biodiversity. They provide better public and walking, cycling routes if they can be integrated into them, and otherwise, and also sort of public realm and environmental benefits. So I think it was probably a typo. And in terms of bus companies, we haven't spoken to any bus companies directly, although I do think that would be useful. We've spoken to the Thurrock Council transport team, who fed us back what they knew. But I certainly think that would be quite useful to know what their plans are.
I think it would definitely be useful to speak to some bus companies as part of the next stages of work.
Yeah, I think they know it. So we need to either have them come to us to tell us what they feel. That would give us an insight into what's happening across the borough then, wouldn't it?
Definitely.
Okay. Has anybody else got any more questions at all?
I think Councillor Rice had his.
Councillor Rice?
Yes, Chair. There were a couple of issues. You mentioned about the flood risk of Tilbury. You might be aware, I'm sure you are aware, that at this Friday's meeting of the Environment Agency, there'll be a further update on the Tilbury floodgate, which will protect the 12,000 residents in Tilbury. It will further protect the residents of Little Thurrock and Grays. And this is a joint project between the Port of Tilbury and, of course, the Environment Agency, not only to protect the port, but also to protect those surrounding areas. So that's just a matter of information. When Councillor Kerrin mentioned Grays Athletic, I did have one question on that. When the Section 106 was put together, and perhaps Lee might be able to answer this question, there was £750,000 set aside in the 106 agreement that Grays Athletic could actually use to look for another site. I just want to be aware that that money is still within the council system, and that developer that money is still available to Grays Athletic. And my final question, Chair, is we've talked about the delivery of the plan. Really, what I would like to understand this evening is, when will we actually have a local plan? Will it be 23, 24, or will it slip further into 25? Because the local plan is very important, because we're still working off an old local plan going back to the 90s. So, it's very important we get an up-to-date plan.
Thanks, Councillor Rice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to come in on that, Anna or Lizzie?
I think in relation to the flood risk issue, thank you for that information on the Tilbury floodgate. That's useful information which we will reflect in the report. So
the 106 money is not really in your remit, is it? I would imagine
no.
Lee come in on that. Lee?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we'll absolutely check that point around Section 106 monies and come back to members. And just in terms of the deadline for the local plan, that's going to be covered in the next report, the next item on the agenda. But there is an expectation of local authorities, a government expectation on local authorities to have local plans in place by 2023. So that's the date that we'll be working back from when we're looking at these evidence studies, etc.
Lovely. Okay. Thank you, Lee, for that. Are you happy with that, Councillor Rice? Councillor Rice?
Yes,
You
that's
happy
fine.
with that for Lee to come back on that?
No, that's fine. I'm quite
Okay.
happy with those points. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Okay. Has anybody else got any questions at all for Lizzie, Anna? No? Okay. Thank you, Lizzie and Anna and your team.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much. That's been really helpful.
We'll hopefully see you next time.
Yeah, we'll feed information as relevant through Sean and his team.
Thank you. Everybody. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Lee, you or Sean want to take us through the local plan?
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, the report provides members with an update as to where we are with the preparation of the local plan. I will, if with your agreement, Chair, hand over to Sean to take members through the detail, but of course happy to field questions afterwards.
Lovely. Thanks, Lee. Sean?
Okay, thank you, Chair. This is basically a short report to update the members on progress with the local plan, because I think if you remember back, the last meeting of the group was a week before we entered into lockdown.
Yeah.
And the report set out the ambition of getting a new plan adopted by 2023-24. So what we've been doing over the last 4 months or so is basically progressing the development of the evidence base and putting in place infrastructure and arrangements to enable us to move forward in a COVID-19 world. The report in front of you sets out some of the key issues that we need to address over the next few months, particularly in relation to how we consult with the local community. If we didn't have COVID-19 this summer, we would be now undertaking consultations in association with the rollout of the Princess Foundation and Design Charrettes. We would also be entering into discussions with landowners and developers, signing planning performance agreements to enable us to move forward with the development of the local plan. Obviously, we've had to push those back simply because we've not been able to meet face to face with either the community or the landowners and developers. But we've now come up with a series of propositions that will enable us, starting in September, to move forward with the local plan and engage directly with stakeholders and the local community. The first thing we've got to do is to prepare and publish a new statement of community involvement, and it's a requirement of local authorities to set out right from the beginning of the process how are they going to consult and engage with the local community across the whole of the plan making period. If we go to examination with the local plan, the first thing the inspector will do is actually look at how we've consulted and how we maintained what we set out in the SCA and undertaken all the tasks that we've committed ourselves to doing. So clearly we need to give a bit more thought as to how we do that, because we won't have the same opportunity for the foreseeable future to conduct face-to-face meetings with the public. So there'll be more of a reliance upon virtual platforms and digital communications. And that's not ideal, because there will be sections of the community where we don't have access, or the community don't have access to the necessary IT technology to enable them to partake of consultations in a virtual world. So we'll be looking at how we can actually take this forward in a meaningful way. Once we've got the statement of community involvement published, in it we will need to set out how we're going to undertake the Design Charrette rollout. And at previous meetings, we talked about how important it was to get significant community involvement in the process going forward. So they actually represent the community's views of what's required going forward, and they're not officers or consultants' views. And I think going back to the last topic, pushing the infrastructure plan, the idea is that when we have the opportunity to do so, we will be asking the local community what are their needs, how can they best be met through the plan making process, and the work will feed into the next version or iteration of the infrastructure baseline study. So that's one example of how the work starts to sort of link together. I think also in terms of the rollout of design charrettes, we've now got a proposal in place from the Princess Foundation, which will enable us to start workshops in September with landowners, developers and stakeholders to build up a better picture again of the infrastructure requirements needed to deliver the plan, but also what are those challenging planning and transport and climate change issues we need to address on a place-by-place basis. The idea then is, having collected all that information, is to develop a series of options for testing with the local community and engaging with them early next year, with the view to completing that engagement process April, May, and reporting back in the summer. Now, we have a lot of work to do to come up with the most appropriate way of engaging with the community, and that's something that, again, we'll be reporting back to the task force in the autumn. The other thing that we've talked about in the report is we need additional resources to move forward the local plan and to hit that 2023 deadline. And clearly one of the ways we can do that is to enter into planning performance agreements with landowners and developers to enable us to fund technical studies, which we prepare the brief on, we've jointly commissioned, but also to get additional people in. The more money we get in, the more resource we have to progress the plan forward. And at the basis of that is the notion of a development team approach, where the council, service areas, all service areas, and the developers, plus outside agencies such as the Environment Agency, Homes England, Highways England, will all sit around the table and we work through the detailed technical work that's required to deliver the various development propositions across the borough. I should say again, as part of that process, ARAPS will also be involved, so that as we move forward and produce mini infrastructure plans for those development locations, that will also feed into the borough-wide infrastructure delivery plan. So those are the sorts of things that we've got to grapple with over the next 2 to 3 months, and make sure that when we hit the ground running in September, we have a plan in place. And we're doing quite a lot of work now in pulling together that detailed project plan. Again, we hope to be in a position to report back in the autumn on the project plan and the milestones, and give a much firmer view as to the likely trajectory for preparing the local plan.
Okay, thanks, Sean, very much. Councillor Rice.
Yes, Chair. What I would like to understand is when the call for sites will be coming out to the public, because obviously when we do have a call for sites, we will then be able to identify applications that can come forward if those are either in the brown fields or the green fields, and I think that's very important. And also on a Pacific site, I realise at this time the Arena Essex has been blocked by Highways England because of junction 3031. Can we be told, has that been unblocked now by our highways people, or is it still blocked and the application is still pending?
Sean?
Yeah, Lee will probably answer on the Arena Essex site. In terms of the housing sites, call for sites, well, we've had 4 call for sites exercises, probably amassed nearly 500 sites. We will be starting the process of assessing each of those sites over the next few weeks, and that process will probably take the best part of 8 or 9 months, given the size and scale of the undertaking that we need to go through. The idea then is, when we've got the assessment framework in place, is to basically rank sites. So there will be brownfield sites, which will obviously be, if they're appropriate for development, able to go forward without the plan being adopted. However, greenbelt sites, they're slightly more complicated, and we will have to go through the process of assessing those sites in terms of deliverability, sustainability, and also what contribution the sites make in terms of the regeneration of existing communities. So through that process, we'll have a list or a portfolio of sites, which probably, if you use the RAG assessment, red, amber, green, there'll be sites which are probably flood zone 3, which should not necessarily be taken forward. There'll be sites which are amber, where there's a need for infrastructure or further mitigation of development impacts to be undertaken before they move to green, which will then be those sites that will be taken forward within the local plan. But given our numbers, I think it's fair to say that there will be a need for contingencies if you've large strategic sites. Therefore, the amber sites that remain at the end of that process may well be required as we go forward in terms of getting the plan together once we know what our numbers are.
Yes.
Thank you, Sean. Lee? Can I just bring Lee in? Councillor
Yes,
Rice,
of
I'll
course.
come back to you.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So in relation to the Arena Essex site, Highways England have issued a holding objection, and the applicant's transport consultants are carrying out further modelling work to address those concerns with a view to having the objection lifted. But that is the current state of play with regards to the highway matters at that site.
Lovely, thanks, Lee. Councillor Rice?
Yes, perhaps it's a question for Sean. I'm most interested in Chapel St Mary, as you could imagine, Chair. I have had discussions with both Lee and Mr Millard regarding developing from Turnpike Lane, just off the Linford Road, right the way to the bottom of Chadwell, to the Marshfoot Road and the Gateway Academy. And the reason I'm keen to see that tranche of land go is that we could actually develop a bypass which would be invaluable to Chapel St Mary, because what we can't seem to get, we can't take any more traffic through that Cross Keys juncture. And I'm most keen also to get that land developed for one reason, Chair, is because it will bring social housing not only for the residents of Chadwell St Mary, but more importantly, Thurrock generally. And you would be aware that we have a 10-year waiting list at this time, of which you and I and many other councillors that's sitting this evening will have numerous emails daily asking for assistance with housing. And when I quote, you know, people that are sofa sleeping on their grandparents' sofas with 2 grown-up young children, young sons, this really is very unacceptable, and we need to push this social housing forward. So I would be very interested in how we can release that land at Chadwell St Mary so that we can make a substantial start to actually get some social housing for the locality of Chadwell St Mary. And obviously we would need the infrastructure such as the extra schools places, the doctors, the dentists, because they are still all underprovided in the Chadwell St Mary area. So I would be interested in your answer, Sean.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. I think sort of like we all recognise the issues and opportunities that Councillor Rice has just articulated. I think the starting point to answer those is through the design threat approach, and we will be looking at Chadwell St Mary as a whole. And when we take forward that work, that will give the opportunity to the local community members, stakeholders to have those discussions about what infrastructure is required, what land can be brought forward to development, and how that can then help regenerate the existing urban area, but what also are those new facilities that are required. So I think sort of like the points are well made and will be taken up as part of that process, which will then develop further as we move forward with the plan.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there anybody else got any questions?
Councillor Jeffries wants to speak.
Councillor Jeffries?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to go back to what Sean said slightly on, and I may have misunderstood, but I think he said that we should now be out talking to developers, landowners, stakeholders, and the wider community. And COVID-19 has obviously put a bit of a brake on that. I suppose I just want a reassurance that, you know, we've put in place measures to speak to all of these people via Zoom, via Teams, using, technology, because, God forbid, I hope it doesn't happen, but, if we have a spike or if we have a local, spike and we have to lock down here in Thurrock or whatever, hope we don't, but I don't want there to be further delays. Whilst I realise that not everybody will be able to communicate using technology, but we should be able to at least start with people like developers and landowners, and then the wider general public can come in at a later stage if they don't have access to technologies.
Yeah, we'll give every assurance to Councillor that we will be doing all the things that you've mentioned. I think it's sort of like, it's not just the local authority that has to catch up in terms of this new world of virtual engagement. It is also the various industry itself, the planning industry. But we will be, over the next 2 to 3 months, beginning to there's platforms and mechanisms that allow us to consult virtually, and it could be that we will have online tools that enable people to comment directly on emerging options for the development of the borough. But again, we need to test the technology. There will also be the opportunity to hold webinars and to use Zoom and Teams as a means for communicating with landowners and developers. However, obviously, the bigger the number, the more difficult it is to actually manage. So again, what we will be looking to do is, are there community groups that we can liaison with on a sort of like a more discreet and intimate fashion? And also we can do that quite clearly with landowners and developers. But when you look at the ability to hold meetings 200-300, that then becomes very difficult. So as I say, we will give thoughts as to how we can do it in the most effective way, but we are not to hold back preparation at time as COVID-19 gone away or lessened in terms of severity.
Anybody else got any questions at all? Thank you, Sean.
Councillor Spielman.
Councillor Spielman.
Hello, Sean. Hello, Lee. So when am I going to be sitting in council voting on this local plan then? I know there's a political side to that as well, but when do you think it's going to be realistic that we're going to have a plan in front of us? I suppose is my first question.
As I said earlier, I think sort of like the expectation from government is that we all have to have plans adopted by 2023. And clearly we are living and working in a different context to where we were 6 months ago. However, we are confident that if we get the resources in and have project management tools in place, we can actually move the plan on expeditiously. But clearly there are outside influences that we have to take into account, not least of all the lower Thames crossing, what that might mean for the plan making process, but also potential for government policy to change over the next 12 months. And there are indications that government is looking to bring forward further measures to streamline and quicken the planning process, including in the local plan process. So if those come forward, they'll have an impact on how we actually take forward the plan. I think, speaking for the officer team that's involved in the process of pulling the local plan, we are as keen as anybody to get the process up and running and to get that plan out to consultation sooner rather than later. So that's why we're putting in a bit of time and effort in now in terms of getting the right project management tools in place and resources, make sure that once we start, we finish it sooner rather than later.
Can I just follow that up? I'm going to slightly play devil's advocate here. So the lower Thames crossing is going to be significantly delayed by COVID. We've got potential for a radical change in the traffic going across the bridge that hasn't been planned into that because of COVID, because of so many people working at home, means that the original modelling now probably isn't appropriate, probably isn't realistic, because we could have had a fundamental change in the way that we work and travel. Big firms are going to be, probably more cautious at doing big deals. There's going to be potentially a massive squeeze in funding available, apart from in terms of private funding, and you're going to be or on the plus side, there could be a massive increase in central government expenditure on infrastructure to try and force through, you know, get the economy moving again. There's plus sides and there's negatives, but isn't that the picture of this is that at the moment our local plan is completely, you know, the path and the future of this local plan is completely and utterly dependent on external forces that we're not in control of whatsoever.
Sean?
I think, sorry, I was just going to say, Councillor Spillman makes some very good points there. I think sort of like it's beholden upon us to move forward with the preparation of the plan to at least demonstrate the art of the possible in terms of what we could deliver, whether it's homes or jobs. No getting away from that. That has to be the priority to enable recovery to proceed. Now, the numbers, types of jobs, how people are going to use transport is always going to be open to question for the next few years. And we could sit around basically for years waiting till we have perfect information. That's not likely to come forward. So what we do need is to crack on, use a plan that's pragmatic, that's flexible enough to adapt to change. But then that gives us the opportunity 5 years from now, when we've adopted the plan, to actually then look at, well, what were the differences in terms of what we planned for and the way the world has turned out, and then to revise that plan and move on accordingly. I don't think we'll be thanked for waiting till we've got all that perfect information available to make sure the plan is a perfect plan. A good plan will be good sufficient this time. I think that's something that government's got to recognise difficulties we all face in terms of the existing planning system and the levels of information and evidence that we have to produce to justify the plan. So I think there's something that government needs to recognise, but it shouldn't deter us from moving forward with the plan itself.
Can I just have one last bullet, which is,
Yeah.
do you envisage the timescales for the adoption of local plans to be, the deadlines to be extended as a result of COVID? And do you see some, do you suspect there may be some slippage in the Lower Thames crossing in terms of dates as a result of this?
We can hope.
Professionally, I've no idea as to what government's thinking is in relation to the impact of COVID on plan making process. It is continuing to urge local authorities to meet that 2023 target, irrespective of COVID-19. And again, I don't know what the impact of the current pandemic and the sort of economic straits the country finds itself on will be in relation to Lower Thames Crossing. It could spur its implementation, or as others might say, it could actually sort of mean that we don't have the money available and government will reprioritise. That's something I'm not privy to.
Thank you, Sean. Anybody else wish to ask a question?
Councillor Kerrin. Yeah,
Councillor Kerrin.
Councillor Kerrin, you're on mute.
Thank you very much. Just in terms of community engagement, I think firstly, Councillor Jeffries is quite right to mention the need for sort of a more internet savvy consultation because of the potential of lockdowns. But equally, I don't want the point to be lost that there are many residents in Thurrock who either do not have internet access or would rather not take part in a consultation which involves internet access. So I think I'm more sort of setting out the challenge really for you as officers to sort of meet that middle ground of the fact we live in this sort of post-COVID world. We will be headed into that post-COVID world, but also to remember the residents, and they're often the sort of residents who won't want to communicate by internet are often the residents who've lived here the longest and have sort of deeper stake within the borough. And with that in mind, could I really emphasise the need for engagement with residents associations, community forums. In my own ward, I know that the development of the Tops Club was only like a small development compared to the scale that we're looking at with the local plan, but because of good Thurrock Council engagement with the community association, it broadly enjoyed really good local support. And if we could work on that scale to try and get full resident support for the local plan, it means residents will buy into something that's going to affect them for the generation to come. So just really work on that community engagement. And obviously I know things will either get better or get worse depending on how this virus is going to play out. But please keep that proper community engagement in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kerrin. That was brilliant. I think with unprecedented times we're in at the moment, I think our officers are doing the best they can. But as you said, as long as we keep everything open, there's going to be older people who are not going to be able to do what we do, which we find is working really well, you know, with Teams, but and Zoom. But we've got to keep that open. But as long as we're doing a lot of the work that can take us through, I think we'll get there, you know, hopefully. If no sort of, we're not over it yet, you know, by a long chalk. I think we've got a long way to go. We just hope we don't get another spike in it. Councillor Rice.
Yes, Chair. One further question to either Sean or Lee. I just want to understand where we are on the east-facing slips, because the government have given us the go-ahead on that. I just want to understand, has the funding come along to make that project work?
Lee?
Thank you, Chair. So the DFT have requested further highway modelling to support the outline business case. So that modelling work is being undertaken now with a view to completing that for the autumn, to then have the outline business case submitted to the Department for Transport. So that's exactly where we are at the moment.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lee.
Good.
Is that all right, Councillor Rice?
Yeah,
happy?
that's fine.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Is there anybody else? Alex, did you want to come in at all?
The only thing I'd say, Chair, is I think, like with other members, when I read through this report, the thing that jumped out to me was a desire to get assurance that no resident would be left behind when it came to consultation going forward. As other members have already pointed out, we have a lot of people in Thurrock that won't access Teams and the internet, and you know, the more technologically advanced ways of engaging in these processes. And I just want to echo other members in their desire to make really that these residents aren't left behind.
Thanks, Alex. I think most members know how I feel, because I think we've got a lot of people out there who are left behind, you know, who can't.
Yeah.
Hope from Sean, you know, to say that we will get these people whenever, you know, we can do the first lot of work, but we make sure we meet them face to face or a meeting room or something at a later stage. Sean?
Yeah, I think so. Like, one thing we can say is that the vast majority of people have access to a smartphone, and lots of communication too we can use via smartphone, where people could actually use that to access the web. But more particularly, if we actually send them consultation material on the smartphone, they can then click on various options in front of them and give their views. So it's just one of a number of options. And clearly, it's not something that we've practiced before. We do need to give a bit of thought to how we can actually run it, make sure everybody's involved. But there may well be, depending on sort of public health considerations, to do safe distancing meetings as we go forward. So again, that's something we need to look at. But I think sort of like bearing in mind the nature of COVID-19, I think sort of like trying to plan 6 months in advance would leave us in a very difficult position. So we need to be flexible and have plan Bs and Cs if need be, in terms of moving the consultation forward.
Sure. Sean, is there any way that we can get perhaps paper copies out, but with the libraries opening now a little bit more? Is there anything we can get, you know, it doesn't have to be a long form, but just something quick and easy for people to fill in if they want to? You know, there's got to be something we can put a one-pager out in the libraries just to get a feedback from some people.
Yeah, that's something that we will be doing as a matter of course, and obviously through the events that we organise, we will be pointing people at the time to the different things at their disposal for engaging in the process.
Brilliant, thanks, Sean. Councillor Rice?
Yeah, just one further point, Chair. I think we have an excellent facility, which is within your ward, I understand, which is called the Civic Hall. You know, we're able to put, at least in normal times, we could sit perhaps 400 people to a dinner. And I'm sure we could use that facility in a guarded way to allow residents who don't have access to the internet to actually come and view the maps, and so many could be let in at each time, a bit like what we do with our shopping today.
Yeah. When that's open, I would imagine we can do something like that, but at the moment it's still closed. So I just feel that a one-pager thing that can go out just to let people put down their views, at least get something back from people. Is that sort of the thing you want to do, Sean, or could do?
That's something we will do, and obviously the next consultation stage would be the rollout of the design charrettes. So that would be very much place-based, so we can focus on individual communities, and that should make it different, not only in terms of sort of like initiating discussions with the local community in respect to their own place, but also making them aware of the plan making process more generally. The idea is that once we've done the charrettes, as we continue to engage over the next 2 and a bit years as we pull the plan together. And hopefully by then we will be able to go back to more traditional means of communication, but it won't stop us doing so in the short term.
Yeah, if you can do it area by area, it makes it easier for you, doesn't it? And it doesn't bring it into the whole of Thurrock's a big place, isn't it? We can do it bit by bit. It's piecemeal. It's better, isn't it? Is there any other questions from anyone else?
No.
Wendy, have you got anybody? I can't see everybody.
No, Chair, there's no one else.
Okay. I think we've had a good meeting, actually. We've got there's no more questions on the local plan. We've just got the forward work programme. Has anybody got anything they want to bring onto that? September is our next one, isn't it? We haven't got anything at the moment, have we? Is that something, Sean, that the charrettes thing could come back on?
Yes, most definitely. We can provide an update report, setting out what we're going to be doing, the means of communication as well, that we consider for taking forward the local plan. We have a number of studies which are already in train, and it might well be the case that we'll back with those as well.
Is there any way that we can ask the bus companies to send one person, perhaps to our committee, from the bus company, so we can get a little taster of how they feel?
We could do. I mean, I'm conscious of the fact we haven't yet had in-depth discussions with the transport operators on the local plan.
Okay, it might be better in November then.
Yes, because we will be setting up a steering group which will involve all the operators, rail, bus and other, as part of the local plan infrastructure work, transport work. And I think once they're better aware of what we're doing in terms of the local plan and can respond to it, you'll get a better feedback from them in terms of what they can do in terms of delivering the plan and meeting community needs.
How much do the bus companies know of plans that are going on, Sean?
I would say that the majority of transport operators are probably quite blind to the detail of the plan process. They know that there's a plan being prepared, but we haven't had that proper in-depth discussion with them. So that will be taken in the next 2 to 3 months.
Okay, I was only saying that because I chair the bus user group, so it's something we might be able to feed back from there going forward. Councillor Rice.
Yes, Sean, will we have a further report from Arabs on the infrastructure baseline so they can pick up the points we've made tonight as a group?
Yes, a further report will be made available probably before Christmas, because there's quite a bit more work to do because of the impact of COVID-19 in terms of consultation. As I said earlier, it's a living document, and as we prepare all the strategies and studies, they will feed into the ARIPS report.
And finally, Sean, can someone pick up that Grays Athletic thing that Councillor Kerrin did intimate, and you know, that 750,000 that's locked away in that section 106 of the redevelopment of Bridge Road?
Yes, I think Lee's already given an undertaking that he will look into that issue correctly.
Thank you very much.
Lee? Lee?
Yep, sorry, Chair. Yep, I've got that down as a note.
Could you feed that back to most of us, please? Well,
Oh,
especially
yep,
me.
yep, absolutely. We'll
Yeah.
circulate it to the committee.
Because
Yep.
if we're going back to 106 money from when Grays Athletic left there, surely those developers are allowed to have that back, aren't they?
Going straight to sleep.
If it doesn't get used in a certain amount of years, they can ask for it back, can't they?
Yeah, Chair, we'll absolutely look into that and see what the detail is and provide members with an update on the position with that. Yep.
Thanks, Lee. Sean, are we that Arab? Are we saying they come back in January or November?
I think coming back in January would probably be more useful, because we'll have completed more studies that feed into their work.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's lovely. Any more questions from anyone?
Yeah, Councillor Kerrin.
Councillor Kerrin.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, thanks to Councillor Rice for mentioning Grays Athletic. I was going to ask for it to be put on the work programme, but I just want to say I think I've asked before, and it's not in the minutes for last meeting, but I'm sure I did. But if I didn't, it was definitely within the last 1 or 2 meetings I've specifically mentioned it. So just if it could be actually recorded in the minutes, and in that way I think we'll probably get onto it. Thank you.
We did have something that was to say one of them was going to come to speak to us.
Yeah. Oh, good. So I think, Chair, I don't know if your memory is the same as mine. I think it was the last meeting we were at, but you know, I'm glad you've confirmed it. Not just making it up.
I don't know where that one went, so
no.
Perhaps we'll get Wendy or someone to follow that through.
Okay. Thank
you. All right with you, Wendy?
Yes, Chair.
Right with you. You've got everything, yeah.
And if you need contact details of particular people in the club, I've got all that.
Okay.
Is everybody happy?
Thank you.
I think it's actually been a brilliant meeting. A lot of good questions. Thank you all for attending.
Councillor Rice wanted to speak as well.
No. Councillor Rice. Councillor Rice. Just going to have a cup of tea, Wendy.
I've got it now. Lee alluded to Grays Athletic. Could that be sent by email to all the members, so that we're aware of what's happening? That would be most useful.
Councillor Rice.
Yes.
I just did ask that.
Yes. I just wanted to make sure it will happen.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
You're welcome.